The dark story of America's secret elite list. The 400. In a city of millions, only 400 names were said to matter. Behind velvet doors and under gaslit chandeliers, invitations decided who existed and who did not. One list promised status, erased everyone else, and turned New York society into a private kingdom. This was America's most ruthless guest list. Subscribe to Empire Manners for more stories like this. New York City in the late 19th century was exploding with life, money, and ambition, but also with anxiety. After the American Civil War, the city's population surged, crowded with immigrants, self-made millionaires from the Midwest, and families who had only recently discovered what it meant to be rich. Old New York, the families who traced their fortunes back generations, suddenly felt surrounded. For decades, they had believed that breeding mattered more than money. Names like Livingston, Van Rensselaer, and Astor carried a weight that no new railroad fortune could buy overnight. But by the 1880s, new palaces were rising along Fifth Avenue, and the newcomers who built them were no longer content to stand outside the ballroom doors. They wanted to be seen, acknowledged, invited. At the center of this social battlefield stood one woman, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, known simply as Mrs. Astor. Her dark eyes, severe poise, and perfectly measured courtesy made her more than just another wealthy hostess. She was the guardian of old New York, the unofficial queen of the Gilded Age. Her word and her guest list could open or close almost any door. Mrs. Astor did not rule alone. At her side was Ward McAllister, a man whose power came not from great business empires or inherited estates, but from something far more fragile and dangerous: social judgment. McAllister made himself an expert in etiquette, manners, and the subtle art of deciding who belonged. Together, Astor and McAllister became the gatekeepers of what they called society. They saw the city changing and decided to control the change. Wealth, they believed, was not enough. One needed taste, behavior, proper connections, old roots. Immigrants and new millionaires might buy townhouses, art, and grand entertainments. But acceptance into the drawing rooms of Astor's world required something more elusive: permission. McAllister gave that permission a number. He famously declared that there were only 400 people in fashionable New York society. According to him, these were the men and women who truly mattered, the ones who felt at ease in the ballrooms where Mrs. Astor received her guests. Anyone outside that circle, he suggested, either did not know how to behave or made others uncomfortable when they tried. The phrase was cold, precise, and unforgettable. The 400 was no longer just a count. It became a brand of exclusivity. In a city of over 1 million residents, 400 names would stand above all the rest. Almost immediately, people wanted to know, who were they? Rumors spread through newspapers and parlors. Other lists appeared, some claiming that New York society was not 400 people at all, but closer to 150. Some editors mocked the idea that a single man and a single hostess could define the limits of social worth. Yet the curiosity only grew stronger. Being on the list, or left off it, became a matter of pride, gossip, and sometimes humiliation. Meanwhile, Mrs. Astor's own home became part of the myth. Her large brownstone at Fifth Avenue and East 34th Street held a ballroom that New Yorkers whispered could accommodate 400 guests at a time. It was a convenient story, an elegant explanation. The list was 400 because that was all her ballroom could hold. The image was powerful: silk gowns, white gloves, and 400 chosen people beneath one roof, while the rest of the city watched from outside. But the truth was more complicated. Historians would later note that there were other places in New York with similar limits: fashionable restaurants like Delmonico's, local cotillion dances, private clubs that also capped their invitations around the number 400. The figure may have been practical as much as symbolic, a convenient ceiling borrowed from the world these people inhabited. What mattered was not the mathematics, but the message. Inside this narrow social world, Astor and McAllister tried to codify everything. They defended old money and long family trees against the swelling wave of new fortunes. They valued tradition, certain surnames, and a particular way of moving through life. They opposed anything that felt too loud, too eager, too freshly rich. Behind the scenes, McAllister coached the elite on what to wear, how to host, whom to acknowledge. Outside, the city kept changing. its population kept rising. Immigrants arrived in masses at the docks, and wealthy arrivistas from the Midwestern United States and beyond brought in fresh fortunes. Some of them built mansions that rivaled and sometimes surpassed the homes of the old families. They could not be ignored forever. The tension between knobs and swells grew sharper. The knobs were old families like the Astors, the Goulets, the Livingstons, and the Van Rensselaers, names woven into New York's early history. The swells were the newcomers, the nouveau riche, many of them from industrial dynasties like the Vanderbilts. In private, the old families mocked the newcomers' taste, their opulent balls, their showy facades. In public, however, they began to appear together at certain events, carefully managed by people like McAllister. Every invitation, every appearance on a guest list became part of a slow negotiation over who would join the circle of the 400 and who would remain permanently outside it. In the smoky back rooms of clubs and the hushed drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue, a quiet battle over identity, class, and power played out name by name. By the early 1890s, the pressure to reveal the list had become unbearable. Newspapers clamored to print the names. Society columns speculated and taunted. Other writers claimed to have already identified the real elite, printing their own shorter lists and accusing the old guard of exaggeration. Behind the polished manners and carefully arranged portraits, irritation and fear began to grow. The moment was coming when the invisible walls of New York's highest circle would be sketched in ink for the world to see. That moment arrived on February 16, 1892, when the New York Times finally printed the official list of the 400. The headline did not shout. It did not sensationalize. It simply delivered what the public had been begging for: the names of the people who, according to Ward McAllister, represented the highest tier of New York society. Overnight, private invitations became public identity. Social rank, once concealed behind closed doors, had been placed in print for millions to read. For years, the press had tried to guess. Competing papers challenged the idea that New York's true elite numbered 400 at all. Some insisted the real number was closer to 150, a privileged core who attended the most exclusive dinner dances of the season. The World newspaper even mocked McAllister outright, publishing its own list and suggesting that his influence was slipping. But McAllister responded sharply, telling the Times that the shorter lists were unauthorized and absurd, claiming they left out many eligible millionaires whose absence was nothing short of insulting. His explanation was pointed, almost theatrical. There were 3 major dinner dances during the winter season, he said, and each invited only 150 of the highest social set. Across those events, 400 different invitations were issued. That, he insisted, was why the number endured. It was not a fantasy, he argued. It was the rhythm of the season itself, and now, for the first time, he would provide the authorized, reliable, and only correct list. As readers scanned the names, a portrait of the Gilded Age elite unfolded. The list was dominated by bankers, lawyers, real estate magnates, brokers, and railroad men. A new kind of aristocracy shaped not by ancient titles, but by American industry and commerce. Yet scattered among them were remnants of old New York, families whose names reached back to the early days of the colony, whose wealth flowed from old landholdings and legacies preserved across generations. The Astors were there, of course. William Backhouse Astor Jr. and his formidable wife, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, appeared at numbers 4 and 5. They were joined by their relatives, including John Jacob Astor IV and Ava Lowell Willing. The list included the Livingstons, the Goulets, the Van Rensselaers, families whose roots were planted long before the skyscrapers and subway tunnels. But it also welcomed the Vanderbilts, the ultimate symbols of new money. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, Alice Claypool Vanderbilt, and George Washington Vanderbilt all appeared. Their presence confirmed what society had long suspected. Even Mrs. Astor could not keep out the industrial titans forever. The blend of old and new created a picture of a city in transition. Knobs, the guardians of inherited privilege, shared space with swells, the newly rich who built mansions that outshined even the old families. It was an uneasy partnership, held together by the rituals McAllister tried to impose: etiquette, behavior, and the appearance of refinement. But behind the polished veneer, cracks were already forming. The publication triggered immediate backlash. Newspapers mocked the idea that a single man could determine whose social presence mattered. Caricatures appeared portraying McAllister as a pompous schoolmaster scolding Uncle Sam, insisting that America must imitate the snobbery of 19th century England to be considered truly genteel. Parties in the city buzzed with quiet laughter and whispered complaints. Some families who appeared on the list felt embarrassed. Others who were left off seethed with resentment. Even among the elite, McAllister's memoirs, Society as I Have Found It, had already damaged his reputation. His self-promotion irritated the old guard, who preferred their power to be silent, unspoken, and never publicly mapped. They valued privacy and subtlety. They were not movie stars, but in the age before Hollywood, they were the closest thing New York had. As the Times list spread, the criticism intensified. Columnists questioned the accuracy of the names, the legitimacy of the process, and McAllister's authority. Some accused him of petty favoritism. Others suggested that the very idea of the 400 was an attempt to cling to a world that no longer existed, a desperate effort to cage a city that had already outgrown its old boundaries. Yet, despite the backlash, the list captured the public imagination. Here, in hundreds of printed lines, were the men and women who shaped the Gilded Age. Financiers like Frank Gray Griswold, businessmen like Ogden Gourlay, decorators of elaborate balls like Alva Vanderbilt, and figures connected to political dynasties like Julia Dent Grant, granddaughter of Ulysses S. Grant. Each name carried its own story. Some were known for enormous wealth, others for philanthropy, scandal, or influence. Still others were included simply because of a surname that stretched back through centuries of American history. But the list also contained flaws, misspellings, incomplete names, and confusions. Some spouses were included despite being long deceased. McAllister ignored traditions that defined naming etiquette, such as listing unmarried daughters simply as Miss, without a given name. His inconsistencies fueled the criticism. Was this truly the definitive record of America's highest society, or merely the personal preferences of one man who believed he could arrange the social order like place cards at a dinner table? Regardless of the doubts, the 400 became a symbol. It was no longer just a list, it was an idea, a mirror reflecting the power structures of the era. It represented old wealth struggling to maintain its dominance, new wealth clawing for acceptance, and the broader public peering through the keyhole of high society, trying to understand a world that had been invisible for so long. Outside the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue, New York continued to transform. Immigrants built neighborhoods that would become the lifeblood of the city. Skyscrapers began to rise, their steel frames pointing toward a future beyond the control of any one family. And while the 400 imagined themselves as the guardians of culture and refinement, their world was already becoming a museum piece, a snapshot of a moment that would soon be swept aside by the modern age. Yet for a time, the list held power. It decided who danced beneath the chandeliers, who mingled at the most exclusive balls, whose names were mentioned in the same breath as Astor or Vanderbilt. It shaped marriages, alliances, and rivalries. It influenced the way wealth was displayed and the way legacy was maintained. And in the years that followed, as society changed and the old guard aged, new leaders emerged, women who would eventually reshape what social power meant in America. But their rise would not come gently. It would come through spectacle, rivalry, and a hunger to control the world that Mrs. Astor once ruled alone. The reign of the 400 was beginning to shift, and the throne of New York's high society was preparing for a new generation of queens. The shift in power began quietly, not with a single event, but with a change in presence. As Mrs. Astor aged and her influence softened, new figures stepped into the light, women whose confidence, wealth, and ambition redefined what society could look like. They were not caretakers of old tradition. They were architects of a new era. They hosted larger balls, spent more extravagantly, and commanded attention with a force that made even the old guard lift their eyebrows. These women would eventually be called the triumvirate of American society: Mamie Fish, Teresa Fair Ulrichs, and Alva Belmont. Mamie Fish had a sharp wit, a bolder spirit than the generation before her, and a sense of grandeur that bordered on theatrical. Her gatherings were legendary not only for their luxury, but for their unpredictability. She did not merely maintain society, she entertained it, shaping the tone of the Gilded Age with a humor and daring that Mrs. Astor never displayed. Teresa Fair Ulrichs, the Nevada silver heiress, brought Western money into the heart of New York's drawing rooms, challenging the unspoken rule that society belonged solely to those with colonial lineage. Alva Belmont, known first as Alva Vanderbilt, refused to accept the boundaries that old families once imposed. Her 1883 Vanderbilt ball had forced her way into the elite by sheer spectacle, a demonstration that new fortunes could buy cultural power if boldness and vision accompanied the wealth. Their rise signaled the loosening grip of the old guard. The world Mrs. Astor had guarded so fiercely could not remain unchanged. Still, her legacy endured in the 400, the list that attempted to freeze a social hierarchy in time. Yet even that legacy was beginning to blur. The publication of the 1892 list intensified scrutiny. The criticism that followed reshaped the public's understanding of what society really meant. William Dalton Mann, the owner of the gossip magazine Town Topics, claimed it was his duty to expose the sins and hypocrisy of the elite. He wrote with the sharpness of a man who enjoyed watching powerful people squirm. His articles painted the 400 not as paragons of refinement, but as ordinary people dressed in extraordinary wealth, capable of vanity, cruelty, and folly like anyone else. In this shifting narrative, the 400 were no longer unquestioned guardians of taste. They were subjects of satire, curiosity, and sometimes resentment. But even as journalists targeted the list, the public could not look away. Names carried fascination. Among the listed were figures like Frank Gray Griswold, a financier and writer known for his presence in the city's most polished circles. Chauncey Depew, the senator and president of the New York Central Railroad, a man whose connections blended politics and wealth, and families like the Livingstons, whose lineage reached back to America's earliest days. The inclusion of Julia Dent Grant, granddaughter of Ulysses S. Grant, showed how political legacy and social influence intersected in unexpected ways. The portraits and photographs of these individuals revealed a world of tailored gowns, ballroom jewels, meticulously groomed mustaches, and postures practiced for formal portraiture. But none attracted more public attention than the Vanderbilts. Their wealth was so immense, their mansions so extravagant, that they seemed to embody the energy of a new America. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, Alice Claypool Vanderbilt, Florence Adele Vanderbilt Twombly, and George Washington Vanderbilt II each represented a branch of a dynasty that had reshaped the country's economy. Their inclusion on the list signaled a shift in power dynamics. Even Mrs. Astor could not ignore those whose fortunes reshaped the landscape of Manhattan itself. Yet the list contained undeniable flaws. Some names were printed with errors. Some women were listed with titles that ignored long-standing etiquette rules. In at least one case, a spouse who had already passed away appeared as if still living. These mistakes became ammunition for critics. If this list was the pinnacle of New York society, why was it riddled with inaccuracies? The answer, whispered among some, was that the list was not truly a factual record. It was a performance of power. The backlash proved that even within exclusive circles, the idea of a fixed hierarchy was becoming outdated. Social mobility in America was real. Families rose and fell. Fortunes appeared and vanished. New industries created new wealth. Old expectations of lineage could not keep pace with a country transforming itself through railroads, steel, finance, immigration, and the growth of cities. The 400 was a snapshot of a fleeting moment, an attempt to contain an unstable world within clearly marked boundaries. And then, in an unexpected act of literary rebellion, the writer O. Henry responded by publishing a collection of short stories titled The 4 Million. His message was simple and quietly revolutionary. Every person in New York deserved to be acknowledged. Every life held value. His title rejected the elitist assumption that only 400 people mattered. In doing so, he transformed the list from a symbol of exclusivity into a kind of cultural artifact, something to debate, critique, and interpret rather than obey. Decades later, in 2009, the Museum of the City of New York created its own list, the New York City 400, celebrating 400 individuals who shaped the city across 4 centuries. Ward McAllister appeared again, but now he stood not as a grand arbiter of status, but as a historical figure, one voice among many who had shaped the story of New York, Ironically, he became the only person from the original 400 to make the museum's list. The others, once considered essential, had become shadows in the city's vast history, remembered not for their individual legacies but for the social moment their names once represented. But during the Gilded Age, those names mattered. They appeared in society columns, in invitations to debutante balls, in the rosters of cotillions and dinner dances. They determined who entered a room first, whose arm accompanied whom down a staircase, and who had the privilege of being acknowledged by the reigning queen of society. A name on the list meant access to a world defined by etiquette, ornamented wealth, and an intricate code of conduct known only to those born or chosen into it. Inside luxurious parlors, beneath the carvings of marble fireplaces and portraits by celebrated artists, the members of the 400 hosted the gatherings that defined their era. Rooms filled with musicians, candlelight, and the sound of crystal glasses, women in gowns by Worth, men discussing railroads, politics, and art, hosts whose influence extended far beyond the walls of their homes. And yet, each event was built on a fragile foundation, the belief that one list could determine the boundaries of belonging in a rapidly changing world. The contradictions of that world would soon become impossible to ignore. The very forces that made the 400 possible, wealth, immigration, industry, and ambition, were reshaping the nation at a speed no social list could contain. The Gilded Age was already nearing its twilight, and in its shadow, the power of the 400 would begin to dissolve. The final years of this social empire would not be quiet. They would be marked by spectacle, scandal, and a changing definition of what it meant to be truly powerful in America. In the final years of the Gilded Age, the 400 still glittered, but the brilliance was beginning to look brittle. Their world remained one of chandeliers, formal dinners, and elaborate rituals, yet beneath the polished floors, the ground was shifting. The very forces that had built their social empire were now eroding the foundations that once felt unshakable. Industrial power was transforming America, and the cities surrounding their mansions no longer resembled the place they had tried to control through etiquette and exclusivity. Newspapers, now more aggressive and wide-reaching than ever, continued to expose the private habits of the elite. Their names, once carefully protected behind closed doors, became fodder for public amusement. Writers criticized their vanity, mocked their scandals, and questioned their morals. Every ball, every marriage, every feud that once existed behind velvet curtains could now be found on the front page of a gossip column or sketched into a satirical cartoon. The 400, once protected by silence, became characters in a city hungry for stories. As the attention grew, the contradictions within the 400 became more visible. The list had been created to define who mattered in society, yet it also revealed a blurred and imperfect world. McAllister's own involvement had cast doubt on the legitimacy of his selections. His memoirs, filled with self-promotion and anecdotes that irritated the old guard, made him a target. His desire to be seen as the architect of society clashed with the preference for quiet, unspoken influence. Those who once tolerated him began distancing themselves, and the queen he served, Mrs. Astor, could not protect him from the consequences of becoming too visible. Still, the power of the 400 lingered in the elaborate seasonal rituals that defined their lives. Winter meant dinner dances. Spring brought charity events, musicales, and intimate salons. Summer sent them to Newport, where their mansions overlooked the Atlantic, and where they could display their fortunes in competitions of architecture and opulence. Names such as the Goles, the Livingstons, the Depews, the Sloanes, the Webbs, and the Twombleys dominated guest lists, each representing a family whose presence on the social stage gave shape to the era. The city's fascination with them was fueled further by the photographs and portraits that survived, painted by artists like John Singer Sargent and Benjamin Curtis Porter, or captured in studio photographs by Jose Maria Mora and Charles Milton Bell. These images revealed a world of precision and performance. Women posed in silk gowns adorned with pearls. Men stood in tailored coats, holding gloves or canes, their expressions practiced and formal. These portraits were not simple likenesses. They were statements of identity, built for a society where appearance carried the weight of an entire family's reputation. Yet even with all their control over how they were seen, the 400 could not control how society itself was changing. New fortunes emerged faster than old families could respond. Railroads, steel, oil, finance, and manufacturing created opportunities beyond the comprehension of early American elites. Immigrant communities grew stronger, building neighborhoods that would one day define Manhattan, and as skyscrapers began rising, the physical city transformed into something vast, modern, and unstoppable. The quiet drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue could no longer claim ownership over a metropolis reaching skyward. The most profound shift, however, came from within the elite themselves. After Mrs. Astor's death, the triumvirate, Mamie Fish, Teresa Fair Ulrichs, and Alva Belmont, stepped fully into the roles they had been preparing to inherit. Their approach to social leadership differed drastically from the controlled, selective style of the Astor era. Their events were grander, louder, and in many cases more theatrical. They competed with each other in displays of wealth, embracing the spectacle rather than restraining it. Society became less about lineage and more about influence, personality, and the ability to command the public's attention. The new social queens understood that the power of a name did not come from a secret list buried inside a ballroom. It came from visibility, connection, and cultural impact. Their rule coincided with America's growing love for celebrity, a trend that would eventually overshadow the old concept of inherited status altogether. By the early 20th century, the 400 no longer carried the weight it once did. The list itself remained a historical curiosity, but the world around it had evolved too quickly to be defined by rigid social boundaries. The rise of the new century, marked by automobiles, expanding media, and shifting economic realities, made the idea of a fixed elite seem old-fashioned. Even the wealthiest families were forced to adapt to the changes or risk becoming relics of a past era. The symbolic death of the 400 came not through a single moment, but through gradual irrelevance. The list belonged to the age of gas lamps, horse-drawn carriages, and brownstone mansions. It did not belong to a world of electricity, automobiles, and mass communication. New York, now a city in constant motion, made it impossible for any one circle to claim supremacy. The city had outgrown the walls that Mrs. Astor and Ward McAllister once tried to erect. But the story of the 400 did not vanish. It became part of the mythology of the Gilded Age, a reminder of a time when social power mattered as much as financial power. It represented the final attempt to create an American aristocracy based not just on wealth, but on behavior, tradition, and the careful choreography of social life. It was a world filled with contradictions, exclusive yet fragile, glamorous yet anxious, confident yet terrified of losing relevance. The list remains significant today not because it succeeded, but because it revealed a deeper truth about America at the end of the 19th century. It exposed the tension between old and new, between inherited privilege and earned fortune, between the desire to belong and the desire to define who belongs. It captured the dream of creating order in a city that was becoming too vast, too diverse, too ambitious to be controlled by any one group. And though the 400 faded, its echoes linger. They live on in the mansions of Newport, in the portraits preserved in museums, in the names attached to streets and institutions, and in the stories that shaped the imagination of generations. They belong to a moment when America stood on the edge of modernity, unsure whether to hold on to the past or embrace the future. The 400 sought to freeze their world in place. Instead, they became part of history, a snapshot of the Gilded Age, preserved in ink, ambition, and the memory of a city endlessly reinventing itself. Subscribe to Empire Manners for more stories like this.